Is it true that he was fairly intense in the ring?
Oh yeah, he was wound pretty tight. Rick was dangerous.
Is that why Hogan never wrestled?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Rick Rude was so dangerous that even Hulk Hogan avoided stepping into the ring with him. And the Road Warriors openly said he was the toughest man they had ever known. Because everything about him seemed perfect, from his body to his career to the life he was building until a hidden truth within the WWE began to unravel it all, turning the man they called ravishing into a tragic story no one expected. Since Richard Irwin Rude was never meant to die at just 40 years old, yet the same man who made millions of wrestling fans despise him through pure charisma and athletic intensity was found unconscious on his bedroom floor in Alpharetta, Georgia on April 20th, 1999. And within hours, the wrestling world had lost one of its most unforgettable heels, leaving everyone questioning what really happened. Because while the official story points to an accidental overdose, quiet conversations among those who truly knew him hint at something far more disturbing. And to understand how Rick Rude's life ended, we first have to understand who he was and the people who shaped him into the competitor who would become a WWE Hall of Famer. Beginning in Robbinsdale, Minnesota, a working-class suburb of Minneapolis known for producing an extraordinary number of professional wrestlers, including the Road Warriors, Kurt Hennig, Barry Darko, and John Nord, all from the same blue-collar community where Rick Rude grew up alongside them.
Well, we used to work at a bar called Grandma B's in northeast Minneapolis in Minnesota, and it was myself, Rick Rude, both the Road Warriors, and then there was a few other guys after that. We all worked at that bar. And we were all powerlifting and training and, in good shape and everything. And we used to throw guys out the front door of the bar.
These men weren't just bouncers pretending to be tough. They were real athletes training for professional careers. And over the years, the same question rose repeatedly in interviews about who was truly the toughest among this elite group. Yet the fearlessness that made Rude effective as a bouncer became the foundation of his entire identity. Because unlike many wrestlers who only acted tough for their on-screen personas, Rude's reputation for being dangerous was entirely authentic, built through the way he lived.
It was, all of us other guys, we might have been tougher, I don't know, but, I wasn't a fighter, Animal wasn't a fighter, but, if somebody wanted to fight you, you fought.
Right.
But Rick was a different kind of a guy. He was almost like a pit bull, The nicest guy, he would do anything for you. But boy, you crossed him, he'd be the first one to throw the punch, and he'd do everything he could to win,
That pitbull mentality traced directly back to his childhood, since his father was a Golden Gloves boxer and passed down that fighting instinct. And long before his wrestling career began, there were already stories of RDE, engaging in real physical confrontations not staged. Matches like the time as a teenager he attacked the opposing team's goalie after a high school hockey game where the violence was real. The consequences could have been severe, and Rick Rude didn't care, earning a scrapper's reputation that followed him into the professional world. And when you combine that genuine toughness with championship-level arm wrestling skill, you get someone wrestlers genuinely feared. Because when he entered the ring, everyone knew that if things went wrong, Rick wouldn't hesitate to make them pay. Sometimes during the match, sometimes backstage. And when asked later if he was really that intense in the ring, the answer was always the same. He was wound tight, and Rick was dangerous.
Is it true that he was fairly intense in the ring?
Oh yeah, he was wound pretty tight. Rick was dangerous.
Is that why Hogan never wrestled?
Yeah, I'm sure.
That single admission reveals everything about Rick Rude's place in the wrestling world. Because during the late 1980s, Hulk Hogan was the biggest star in the business and faced every major opponent. Yet he never worked any serious program with Rick Rude for one simple reason: Rude was considered too dangerous. And when a wrestler's reputation is strong enough to keep him away from the top champion, that reputation is undeniably real. Yet behind that intimidating presence was someone completely different from the character fans saw on television. Since the ravishing Rick Rude gimmick portrayed him an arrogant ladies' man who mocked male fans while their wives and girlfriends swooned. And he would strip off his robe to reveal custom airbrush tights featuring the face of whichever woman he was pursuing in the storyline, creating a character design specifically to provoke hatred and succeeding better than almost any heel in wrestling history. While the real Rick Rude was the opposite. Consistently remembered by coworkers as loyal, protective, and genuinely kind to those he trusted, Bret Hart often credited RDE with watching his back during the chaotic period after the Montreal Screwjob when Hart was leaving the WWF. And in a business known for betrayal and selfish motives, Rick Rude was a rare figure you could trust completely, earning extraordinary respect from his peers because he was considered one of the best workers in wrestling. A man who could tell a compelling story in the ring, protect his opponent, and still appear as a genuine threat, creating a balance of real toughness and professional skill that made him invaluable, while his creativity matched his physical prowess. As he constantly pitched ideas to bookers and promoters, some conventional, others unusual, including an angle that never aired since 1980s and early 1990s. Wrestling was still family-focused, and his concept was decidedly adult, but the idea demonstrates his mindset as a performer, always seeking ways to provoke reactions, push boundaries, and ensure audiences remembered him long after the show ended. With relationships among fellow wrestlers equally memorable, Rude had habits that drove his colleagues crazy, particularly borrowing things and never returning them. Yet even when they joked about him keeping someone's music forever, the affection in their voices was clear. Because these weren't just coworkers sharing road stories, they were brothers remembering a man they genuinely loved, which made the next event even more devastating. As Rick Rude's career didn't end with retirement, but abruptly in Japan on a spring night in 1994 when a freak accident destroyed everything he had built. Occurring on May 1st, 1994, in Fukuoka, Japan, at WCW Spring Stampede, where he was defending the WCW International World Heavyweight Championship against Sting in what should have been a display of professional excellence, but instead became the night his in-ring career effectively ended. Because although the match lasted 30 minutes to a time limit draw, the real damage happened earlier when Sting attempted a diving move from the top rope while RDE was positioned on a steel chair. The timing went wrong, the impact landed improperly, and Rick RDE's cervical spine bore the full force. The herniated discs at C4, C5, and C5, C6 compressed Rick Rude's spinal cord, and he described an immediate electric shock down both arms with a sudden loss of strength, after which he was stretchered out of the arena and flown back to the United States the same night, where doctors initially warned he might never walk again without surgery. Although an anterior cervical fusion restored his mobility, it left him with permanent nerve damage and chronic pain. And by June 1990, WCW stripped him of the international title and officially ended his in-ring career, meaning that at just 35 years old, one of wrestling's greatest heels was finished, or so everyone thought, because while the injuries changed him, they never diminished his intensity, and stories of backstage confrontations with wrestlers who failed to meet his standards continued to surface. As the Robbinsdale Code dictated that you protect your opponent in the ring but settle careless injuries backstage, a code Rude lived by, and even after leaving active competition, he refused to disappear, transitioning into managing and commentary to remain in the business despite his body failing him. Then came 1997, and Rick Rude pulled off a feat no wrestler had before or since. Following the Montreal Screwjob, the explosive finish to Bret Hart vs. Shawn Michaels at Survivor Series, RDE made a choice that stunned the wrestling world by walking out of WWFN, protest, and immediately contacting WCW about appearing on their programming, creating a once-in-a-lifetime scenario because on November 17, 1997, Monday Night Raw was pre-taped while Monday Nitro aired live, and Rude appeared on Raw clean-shaven in DX gear beside Shawn Michaels and Triple H. Then just an hour later showed up on the live Nitro broadcast with a full beard and suit, officially rejoining the NWO, becoming the first and only performer to appear on both companies' flagship shows in the same night, leaving fans flipping between channels in disbelief. Eric Bischoff had instructed him to shave for Raw and regrow the beard for Nitro to make the contrast unmistakable, turning the stunt into one of the most iconic moments of the Monday Night Wars and a direct statement to WWF about the chaotic state of the industry. Yet what most fans never realized was that RDE was still collecting WWF paychecks throughout the entire event. His Lloyd's of London disability insurance policy continued paying him whether he worked or not, as long as he never took a bump, which explains why RDE spent 5 weeks in ECW during October and November 1997 strictly as a color commentator and special enforcer, never wrestling, always protected, while Paul Heyman gave him full creative freedom and paid him cash under the table. even as WWF continued sending checks, creating the perfect hustle for someone who understood the system. Yet the chronic pain from his 1994 injuries never eased, requiring constant management with medication, painkillers, muscle relaxants, and sleep aids. And what had once been optional pharmaceutical fixes for physical issues became essential for survival.
But they were pretty salty guys, because him and Heenan and all those guys and one of those Road Warriors come from up there, so they all had this little high school rivalry, and they're all pretty little tough little cookies, especially Rude. And Rude was a kind of a kind of salty kind of guy.
The bitterness ran deeper than anyone realized, as multiple colleagues noted that despite his flawless physique and the confident on-screen persona he projected, Rick RDE privately struggled with self-consciousness and depression, meaning the man whose entire character was built on absolute confidence was secretly battling inner demons that no audience ever saw.
I knew Rude had, I think, a little bit of a depression problem. And for the way he looked, he was always ripped up and looked good. He actually had a little bit of a self-conscious issue. You know what I mean? He always was wondering how he looked and how he was.
This psychological vulnerability, combined with his growing dependence on medication, created a dangerous situation. And by late 1998, WCW quietly released Rude because his neck and back issues made him unreliable even for non-wrestling roles. Yet instead of accepting retirement, Rick Rude secretly trained for a comeback at local gyms in Alpharetta, Georgia, pushing his injured body hard. And colleagues said he looked better than he had in years benching, doing cardio, and planning a return for late 1999 or early 2000 only for his life to abruptly end, shocking the wrestling world, with Jim Ross announcing on Raw that Rick Rude had died of heart failure at age 40. Offering condolences to the RDE family, the brief announcement masked the depth of grief among his colleagues. Shawn Michaels called RDE the coolest person on the planet and said DX had lost a huge part of what made them special. Triple H called him the blueprint for everything cool in wrestling and said his death was a gut punch. Sting revealed they had been planning one more run together just before RDE passed. Paul Heyman said that during Rude's 5-week ECW stint, he was the single coolest person he had ever booked. And Kurt Hennig, who would die just 4 years later, shared that he had spoken to Rude 2 days prior, and he had sounded great, excited for his comeback. On the morning of April 20th, 1999, Rick trained at a local gym in Alpharetta with his protege Mike Bell, looking and feeling better than he had in years, completing an intense workout of heavy bench presses and cardio, signaling a man preparing for a major return to the ring after 5 years away. That afternoon he came home, told his wife Michelle he was wiped out, and went upstairs for a nap. It was the kind of exhaustion that comes from pushing a damaged body beyond its limits, something Rick RDE had done his entire life, but this time would be different. Around 3:30 p.m., Michelle found him unconscious on the bedroom floor, having vomited and not breathing, with empty prescription bottles containing Valium, GHB, and other medications that had become as essential to his daily life as food and water. The chronic pain from his 1994 neck injury never eased, and the medications that dulled it were now permanent fixtures in his routine. Paramedics arrived within minutes to find him in full cardiac arrest, working frantically to restart his heart twice with defibrillation in the ambulance, offering a flicker of hope because with Rick Rude, there was always hope. At North Fulton Regional Hospital in Roswell, Georgia, doctors briefly restored a pulse, making it seem, if only for a moment, that Rick RDE might cheat death just as he had cheated so many opponents in the ring. Then a second cardiac arrest struck around 5:15 p.m., and this one proved irreversible. At 5:37 p.m., Richard Irwin RDE was pronounced dead at just 40 years, 4 months, and 13 days old. The official cause was listed as congestive heart failure triggered by an overdose of mixed prescription medications, and the Fulton County coroner ruled it accidental, closing the case on yet another wrestler claimed to Young by the lifestyle that had made him famous, a fate the wrestling world had seen before and would see again. Yet those who truly knew Rick Rude tell a far different story, one of medical complications, psychological struggles, and circumstances far more troubling than a simple accidental overdose. Wrestling legend Ken Patera shared in multiple interviews that, according to Jim Neihart, one of Rude's closest friends, Rick had been dealing with intimate dysfunction as a result of years of steroid use, with the very substances that sculpted his perfect physique simultaneously destroying him internally. To address the problem, Rude allegedly injected medication directly into a sensitive area, a practice not uncommon among men facing similar issues, but one that carried severe risks for Rick RDE. Those risks materialized in the worst possible way. The injection caused a severe infection that spread rapidly and demanded immediate medical attention. The graphic nature of these events explains why this part of his story rarely appears in official histories or mainstream documentaries. According to multiple sources close to Rude, the infection was initially misdiagnosed, with doctors reportedly fearing something far more serious, possibly cancer. By the time the correct diagnosis was made, the infection had progressed to the point where emergency surgery was the only option. While the procedure saved his life, it also took something that, for Rick RDE, may have felt worse than death itself. Infected tissue had to be removed. For a man whose public identity was built entirely on physical perfection and attractiveness, someone who earned millions gyrating his hips as women screamed and men seethed with jealousy, this loss was psychologically devastating. The ravishing Rick Rude character relied on masculine confidence, airbrushed tights, a provocative entrance, and the illusion that he was looking directly at every woman in the audience. That character demanded a physical certainty Rick could no longer possess. The man who had once had everything that made him ravishing had lost the one thing he could never replace. Multiple wrestlers have even confirmed hearing about a prior attempt on his own life before April 20th, 1999, if true. This perspective fundamentally alters how we interpret Rick RDE's death. The official classification of accidental overdose becomes questionable when considered alongside a man who had already reportedly attempted to end his suffering. The medications found in his system, and particularly GHB and Valium, are potentially lethal even in moderate doses. GHB, immensely popular among wrestlers in the 1990s and nicknamed the Goodnight Kiss, induced deep restorative sleep, helping battered bodies recover from the nightly physical toll of wrestling. Yet its therapeutic window was razor thin. The difference between a dose that aided sleep and one that stopped breathing measured in mere milliliters. When combined with other depressants like alcohol, Valium, or painkillers, the margin for error vanished entirely, a risk Rick RDE fully understood, as did every wrestler who used it. The haunting question for those closest to him remains whether he even cared. Although the toxicology report confirmed multiple substances in his system, the exact combinations and quantities were redacted from public records. What is certain is that Rick RDE had been managing chronic pain for 5 years following his career-ending injury. The herniated discs, nerve damage, and constant stiffness never truly went away. And the medications that made Rick RDE's life bearable also made it dangerously fragile, trapping him in a daily balancing act between taking enough to function and taking so much that survival itself became uncertain. Those closest to him remain divided about what truly happened. Some believe it was a tragic accident, a man exhausted from an intense training session who simply misjudged his medication after pushing his broken body too far, perhaps needing more help sleeping than usual, or falling victim to the razor-thin margin between a safe dose of GHB and a fatal one when mixed with Valium. Others think the medical complications he faced in the months before his death shattered his will to live. Colleagues recalled that behind his confident on-screen persona, Rick RDE battled lifelong self-consciousness and depression, always questioning whether he still looked the part. And the surgery that saved his life may have taken from him something he believed was essential to his identity, leaving a man already defined by pain now struggling with a loss he could not outrun. Without it, perhaps Rick RDE simply couldn't find a reason to go on. Yet others suggest the truth lies somewhere in between, a man who didn't actively try to end his life, but also didn't particularly care if his choices proved fatal. This perspective holds that Rick Rude knew the risks of mixing medications, understood the dangers of GHB, and accepted that each night he went to sleep there was a chance he wouldn't wake up making peace with the possibility. Not suicide in the traditional sense, but not quite an accident either. A man who stopped struggling to survive without ever consciously deciding to die. Those closest to him cannot agree, perhaps because that was the point, as Rick Rude kept his demons private, never letting the millions who watched him perform see the battles he fought alone. What is certain is that the wrestling world lost one of its greatest performers far too soon. Jim Ross announced his death on Raw with brief condolences to the Rude family. Yet the brevity of the statement masked the depth of the impact. Shawn Michaels called him the coolest person on the planet and said DX had lost a huge part of what made them special. Triple H described him the blueprint for everything cool in wrestling and called his death a gut punch. Sting revealed they had been planning one more run together just before Rude passed, and Kurt Hennig, who would tragically die only 4 years later, said he had spoken to Rick 2 days before his death and noticed nothing wrong. Rude had sounded great, full of excitement for the future and ready to make his comeback. And Bobby Heenan, who managed RDE during his greatest WWE run, called him the perfect heel because he was a better person than 99% of the babyfaces, an assessment that captures the central tragedy of Rick Rude's life. A genuinely good man who played a genuinely bad character so convincingly that most people never saw the difference. In 2017, Rick Rude was posthumously inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, with his family accepting the honor while Ricky Steamboat delivered the induction speech. Reflecting on what might have been years Rude should have had, the matches he should have wrestled, the moments he should have experienced said because the 1994 injury had robbed him of his prime and the events of 1999 had taken everything else. The tragedy did not end with Rick Rude's death. His son Colton died in a motorcycle accident in 2016 at just 19 years old, leaving Michelle RDE to endure the loss of both her husband and her son within 17 years, a devastating reminder that wrestling's dark side reaches far beyond the performers themselves, leaving families with wounds that never fully heal. Rick RDE is buried at Green Lawn Cemetery in Roswell, Georgia, with a headstone reading, "Ravishing Rick Rude. Simply the best," a fitting epitaph for a man who demanded excellence from himself and everyone around him. Though whether he achieved that excellence in his final moments, whether he found peace, or simply found an end remains unknown. While the wrestling industry has changed since 1999, implementing wellness policies, mandatory drug testing, and moving away from the casual pharmaceutical culture that defined the 1980s and 1990s towards something slightly more accountable, but wrestlers still die young, and bodies still break down because the toll of performing night after night, year after year, never truly disappears, and Rick RDE understood that burden better than most, having paid it with his neck in 1994, with his body in the years that followed. And on April 20th, 1999, he paid the final price. The legends who knew him can only speculate about what really happened that day in the Alpharetta bedroom. Was it an accident? Was it intentional? Or was it something in between? The official record says one thing, while the whispered conversations among those who loved him suggest another, making the truth, like Rick Rude himself, complicated. Yet everyone who knew him agrees on one point: Rick Rude deserved better than the ending he received. He deserved to grow old, to watch his son become a man, to witness his legacy honored while he could still appreciate it. Instead, he became another cautionary tale, another name on the long list of wrestlers who died too young. And another reminder that the entertainment we enjoy comes at a cost paid by real human beings. Ravishing Rick Rude, simply the best, was gone at 40, leaving questions about why that will never fully be answered.